Fadl argues that Islamic fundamentalists misinterpret the Qur'an in his new book, The Great Theft. This talk from the World Affairs Council in Washington, D.C. is just over an hour.
Today's Meet the Author program features Khaled Abou El Fadl, author of The Great Theft, Wresting Islam from Extremists. In his new book, Dr. Abou El Fadl passionately defends Islam against the encroaching power of the extremists. He presents his beliefs and the practices of modern Muslims and identifies the points of differences and disagreements with the fundamentalist Puritan practice of Islam. Khaled Abou El Fadl, one of the leading thinkers on Islamic law, is a professor of law at UCLA, where he teaches courses related to human rights and terrorism. He's also been a visiting professor at Yale Law School, where he taught national security law, Islamic law, and immigration law. Dr. Abou El Fadl holds degrees from Yale University, the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and Princeton University. Dr. Abou El Fadl is an Islamic jurist and scholar who has received more than 13 years of formal training in Islamic jurisprudence in Egypt and Kuwait. He's been called a longtime champion of human rights by the Los Angeles Times and serves on the board of Human Rights Watch. He was also appointed by President George W. Bush to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and is a Carnegie Foundation scholar. Dr. Abou El Fadl has authored 10 books, including Conference of the Books, The Search for Beauty in Islam, and Speaking in God's Name, Islamic Law, Authority, and Women, and has published over 50 articles on Islamic law and Islam. His latest book, The Great Theft, Wresting Islam from the Extremists, has been called by the National Review one of the most formidable weapons in the battle against Islamic fundamentalism. As president of the Asia Foundation, I'm especially intrigued by the topics of intra-Islamic dialogue. One of our commitments is developing governance, civil education, international relation programs in countries like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Thailand, which foster debate and understanding of democracy within an Islamic context, and I look forward to hearing his views. Please join me in welcoming this evening's guest speaker, Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be with you this evening. If by the way, if this makes Cody's feel any better, I've been to your bookstore about, I don't know, numerous times, and I've spent thousands of dollars there. So I'll accept their fund if you want. Spent too much money on books all my life. Anyway, that's a different topic altogether. The Great Theft. First, I should say that I've with my publishers, we've wrestled with the appropriate title for this book. How to get the message across and yet come to somewhat accurately describe what I was attempting to do in this book. The basic genesis of this book was the fact that often in teaching Islamic law, which is one of the fields that I do teach at UCLA Law School, and often in lecturing, there is this prevailing sense that from audiences, from students who sort of have an attitude towards Islamic extremism like pornography. We know it when we see it, but we can't define it, we can't describe it. I forget which justice said this about pornography, but it's there. So there is just a world of a mess in terms of what counts as an Islamic fundamentalist or an Islamic extremist. Perhaps reflecting the part of this confusion was when I read an author who I don't admire very much write a rather lengthy article about yours truly speaking about the stealth Islamist. And, it basically, he argues that I am a stealth extremist, who's very good at tricking everyone, and but I lurk in the dark and sit there at night and laugh madly as I draw my plots to overthrow the governments of the world and so on. It was an intriguing image considering how tedious my nightly life is. But anyway. So, I mean, if you would sit and listen to the television channels, people on the radio, politicians, leave alone students, is an Islamist, is an extremist, someone who prays 5 times a day and observes the fast of Ramadan. Sometimes people speak as if that is the case. Is an extremist someone who makes the autonomous decision to a woman to cover her hair? Is this a fundamentalist, or is this a Puritan? Is it? At one time, a Western government contacted me and asked me if I would be willing to testify in a particular governmental proceedings that any Muslim who believes in Sharia law is by definition an extremist and therefore should be precluded from being granted asylum. Is that true? Anyone that accepts any part of Sharia law, by definition, is an enemy of humankind, sort of the old concept of a hostis Germanus, the enemy of all humankind that must be given no quarter. What I sensed is a remarkably deep level of confusion, but the confusion was not just in the West and not just in the non-Muslim world. The confusion transcends it to the Muslim world. There was, to just give you an example, I was interviewed on an Egyptian show with a well-known Marxist writer, and the issue that we were debating was whether a female broadcaster who works for Egyptian television, what is expected is that the broadcaster would spend a lot of money on her hair and on her makeup, and probably more money than she makes in the first place, looking pretty. Well, what if the broadcaster decided to wear the hijab, to cover her hair? And there was the Ministry of Information in Egypt took the position that a female broadcaster who does that should be fired because only those who are not veiled should be allowed to read the news or present, top 20 songs or whatever it is that broadcasters do. And in this debate, I actually disagreed very much with this position. And the Marxist fellow supported this position. And as we went back and forth, he was not a lawyer, and I am, so I frustrated the heck out of him. So, in agony and frustration, he started yelling, "You're a terrorist. This is a terrorist." So the confusion even extends to Muslim countries. The important thing is, for both Muslims and non-Muslims, there's sort of a dark area, like a black hole. It's easy, convenient, rhetorical to say something like, that we have those who are Islam is a peace-loving religion, so those who love peace are good, and those who don't love peace are not good, and they're not Muslims. Or to speak of all extremists as not Muslim, but at the same time, there's something in us that prevents us from accepting this, because we know that they rely on a theology. It's not like they sit in the dark and in the stealth model and just invent things out of thin air. So the dark area is what exactly are the theological premises, the theological arguments between what I chose to call Puritans rather than fundamentalists or extremists, and I explain why I choose that term, and what we call Muslim moderates. Now, interestingly, in Arabic, there is no expression such as Muslim moderates. There's simply an expression for Muslims and an expression for extremists or fanatics, which it sort of reflects an interesting phenomena, is that, as I argue in the book, Muslim moderates are in many ways the Muslim mainstream. The vast majority of Muslims who go about their lives and feed their children and pursue their careers and suffer quite a bit from oppressive governments, and in some cases they've managed to achieve a degree of liberty that is higher than others, such as in Malaysia or Indonesia recently. But what are the fundamental disagreements between a bin Laden, for instance, and a Khaled Abou El Fadl, or any of the writers that find no inconsistency between Islam and human rights, or Islam and democracy, or Islam and respecting the dignity of other human beings who do not follow the Islamic faith, or respecting the dignity of women, and so on. What texts do they use? How do they read these texts? And why do they disagree about them the way that they disagree about them? And for the sake of non-Muslims and Muslims, in attempting to advance a more rational way of debating the issues, a more, if you will, disciplined way of talking about these issues. What this book does is that it explains the origins of modern extremism. There has been in the past other extremist movements that have been marginalized. The extremist movement that exists in the modern age is proving to be more challenging because it is supported in ways that previous extremist movements have not been supported, particularly financially, by Saudi Arabia in particular. But other than the financial support, there still remains the issue of substance. And the book walks the reader through the theological, legal debates, the disagreements about the way that each group understands God, understands the role of the Prophet Muhammad, the character of the Prophet Muhammad, the role of texts, understanding history, understanding the role of human beings, and so on and so forth. It's I intentionally wrote it as an accessible book, and my publishers would have killed me if I didn't, because I think when our president starts to speak about radicals who want to create an evil empire that extends from Spain to Indonesia, we are talking about policy matters that are not just going to affect us very deeply, but they're going to affect practically every human being on the face of this earth. Every human being is going to be involved in some way or another. And so it is imperative that before we confront these issues and make up our mind as to whether we support a particular vision or not, that we understand the alphabet of the problem. And so, in many ways, this book is just about the alphabet. That's it. I wrote a book about the alphabet. How exciting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's up to the audience to explore some of those fundamental differences, but I have a few questions to start us off while I sort through those that are just coming in. One of the questions here is, what do you think the biggest myth is in the West today regarding Islam? And if you'd care to take on a really tough one, how would you compare Christian fundamentalism in this country with Islamic fundamentalism, if you can?
Well, the biggest myth, well, I would say they're sort of interconnected. One, that Islam at this point is an Arab religion. Arabs are 10% of Muslims in the world. And there's a clear tendency to be only interested in the Arab world and to equate the Arab world with Islam, which is just accurate, and historically not accurate, because one of the interesting things is that the vast majority of the jurists of Islam, the sages of Islam, were not Arabs. They came from places like Tajikistan and Bakhuristan and so on and so forth, but they were not actually, the vast majority were not Arabs. And then related myth is the myth of homogeneity of Muslims, that you sort of, that there is such a thing as the Muslim mind, where you can study the anthropology of a Muslim village in Tunisia. And this is actually a real-life example, and a real-life professor and a real-life book, who studied the anthropology of a Muslim village in Morocco, and wrote a book about the Muslim character and what Muslims believe, what Muslims do, the Muslim, and what the Muslim does. Now, as to Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism, you know, in a very strong sense, I remember when I read Mark Knowles' book, The Evangelical Mind, I was, I was sort of jumping off my seat, surprised, because much of what he said, I could have just scratched the word Christian and put Muslim, and it would have applied rather perfectly. The difference, I think, is, well, there's an obvious one, is that we're dealing with different texts, but the methods of interpretation are remarkably similar. But the more important difference is that the fundamentalists of the Muslim world are a people who feel a very deep sense of political and social defeat. I've called them in one of my articles sort of the orphans of modernity. They have the misfortune of being born at a time where a civilization has crumbled, the Islamic civilization, and people who become fanatics at times where a civilization has curved and met its death, go through a miserably horrendous time, because they have dreams of grandeur that are just not attainable. And that's a social historical difference, but I think it's a difference that makes that has a practical effect.
I think we have a terrific number of excellent questions here. What does Islam, or perhaps what does Muhammad really say about women's role?
Well, the easy answer is read the book. This is what I always tell my students: read the book. And then they come say, and I say, read the book again. I think it's a mistake, like in all major religious traditions, all complex religious traditions. If you are a fundamentalist, you will believe that we can know with a degree of certainty what Moses says about women, what Jesus says about women, and what Muhammad says about women. That a fundamentalist is a purist, and in many ways, a fundamentalist believes that history is irrelevant, that you can reclaim the truth about a historical figure with a comfortable degree of certainty. I don't subscribe to this fundamentalist methodology. I don't think it is possible to say or answer a question like, what does Muhammad say about women, or what does Jesus say about women, or what does Moses say about women? Because they say a lot of different things. And it's not because we know that they said those things, but because there are human beings who reported and interpreted what each of these great historical characters said. So there's a tradition in Islam, a strong tradition, where Muhammad speaks, for instance, about his wife Khadija in terms of honoring her in the greatest sense. Speaks about men who issue commands to their wives as if they're maids or slaves, as despicable human beings. The Qur'an, the holy book of Islam, at one point, for instance, says men and women are the supporters of each other. They command the good and forbid the evil, so they have a joint enterprise. There is, again, within that tradition, the prophet insisting over the protests of men that women be thoroughly involved in the political process and that they give their bay'ah, their vote, and etc., etc. But if you speak to a Wahhabi, one of those Puritans, he will give you a very different Muhammad. Now, he will bring reports about how if a man orders his wife to satisfy him sexually, she must do so promptly and without question. If he orders her to something, she must do so, even if it's not seeing her parents. I see these in all the traditions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and I can extend it to Buddhism, Hinduism. It doesn't really, even the American Constitution and the early settlers. There are traditions in tension because there is an intense negotiative process that takes place in attempting to use great historical figures, great historical documents, great historical forefathers, and to get them to support a particular cause. does this, and that's why in law school, I get sick of the number of times that, I hear Jefferson, Jefferson, according to law schools, or George Washington, were people who suffered from very deep split personalities. Jefferson had about 10 different personalities, and George Washington had about 20 of them. Now, does this mean that we just give up and we don't know history? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that a Puritan believes that they can reclaim a historical identity and declare it as the truth, and that if you do not agree, then you are an idiot, a moron, ignorant, or even worse, someone who should die. Maybe some of our Supremes on the Great Court, would think anyone who disagrees about Jefferson or George Washington is a moron, idiot, and maybe should die. But someone who is endowed with modesty vis-a-vis knowledge would offer an interpretation, tempering this interpretation with the modesty of knowing that it is an interpretation, a probability, an argued probability, accepting fully well that they might be mistaken, and accepting it with an open heart and with a heart geared towards discourse and debate and a reciprocal mutual learning process.
This one starts with a statement. Since we in the West think of Islamic states as theocracies, give us your explanation of what a democracy would look like in an Islamic context. Given Sharia law, what would a Islamic democracy look like?
Well, listen, if someone would have posed the question of, given Talmudic law, what would a Jewish state look like before 1948, right? I am willing to bet that every response would have been way off. I mean, just completely wrong. And it would have depended on who you talk to. The character of the Jewish state as it exists today, in some ways, it is fulfillment of the ideals of the Talmud. In some ways, it is not. In some ways, it is part of the Jewish tradition. In some ways, it isn't. Now, the important point is this. You in the West, and in fact, not just in the West, Muslims as well, think of the Islamic State as a theocracy. But that's a very interesting question, because if a theocracy means that theologians rule, govern the state, is that what it would say theocracy is, right? Well, until the modern age, until the post-colonial age, that has never happened. Theologians have never ruled throughout Islamic history. Those who ruled were always secular rulers who were often in tension with theologians. Sometimes they would try to bribe theologians. Sometimes they would put them in jail. Sometimes they would flog them in public. Sometimes he would send them in exile, but until the post-colonial age, there was never a Muslim state governed by theologian. That's first. Second, the idea of the nation state is a fairly novel idea. I mean, it's a contemporary phenomenon. Those who simply wanted to take whatever vision of Sharia law they have and just, sort of window dress it over the nation state ended up with highly schizophrenic, self-contradictory, hypocritical, and practically insane models like Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's just no way around it. Is Saudi Arabia governed by Sharia law? You must be, you must have a very, very particular view of Sharia law to give a positive answer. In my opinion, the United States is closer to Sharia law than Saudi Arabia. I find most definitely American constitutional law closer to Sharia law than whatever whimsical constitutionalism exists in Saudi Arabia. I definitely find the law of habeas corpus far nearer to the ideals of Sharia law than the system of habeas corpus in Saudi Arabia, which consists of please don't kill me. Not a very effective system. What is essential is that the puritanical model of saying we're going to have a nation state and we know what God's law is and we're going to apply God's law, in my view, displaces God altogether. God is too majestic to be encapsulated within a code of law, and is too grand for any human being to have the arrogance of saying that they represent God when they apply the law.
Since we're on the Saudis, we have a Saudi question here that I'll advance over its normal place in line here. The Saudi Wahhabism link. Is the Saudi kingdom inextricably related to the genesis of Wahhabism, or is in fact the Saudi government buying off the proponents of Wahhabism by their support for it in various parts of the world?
That's a very good question, and on this, I'm serious. Please read the book, because it's a question that I take some delight in discussing at length. But the short version of it is this: the Al Saud family, for historical reasons, created a codependent relationship with Wahhabism. The Al Sauds provided a lot of resources, critical resources that Wahhabis needed in order to spread their creed within Arabia, and the Wahhabis provided Al Saud with a religious doctrine as they thought to dominate Arabia. Now, just so to give you a sense of a picture, before the Saudi state, Arabia was one of the most theologically diverse places in the Muslim world. in terms of various schools of jurisprudence and so on, there used to be a Maliki Mufti, a Hanafi Mufti, a Shafi'i Mufti, a Hanbali Mufti, a Ja'fari Mufti, a Zaidi Mufti. I mean, so all the schools of thought were represented in this around the Mecca-Medina area because it was thought that since Mecca and Medina belonged to all Muslims, then Mecca and Medina must reflect the diversity of the Muslim world. So there were, I don't know how many different Sufi orders, counting in the well over 100. There were contingents from all over the Muslim world and so on. Al Saud could not, the type of absolute political authority that Al Saud wanted, both in Hijaz and Najd, the two main areas of that constitute Saudi Arabia, he could not preserve this diversity. And it happened to be that Wahhabis found this diversity deeply offensive. And I mean, as far as they were concerned, this was just heretical, pure and simple, and had to be demolished. And it was true. The Al Sauds and the Wahhabis got together and they destroyed not just the diversity that existed in Mecca and Medina, but they even destroyed the history that existed in Mecca and Medina. Out of 20,000 historical monuments or sites, today only 40 remain, and even those 40 are in the process of being destroyed. I mean, so it was a complete, not just enforcing a homogeneity in the center or the heart of the Muslim world, but it's also eradicating history, because history preserves plurality and diversity and so on. Now, Saudi Arabia was faced with a real conundrum once they obtained control of Mecca and Medina. They insisted on absolute authority over Mecca and Medina. They thought to obtain a lot of legitimacy from that, but there was a real problem. And that is, if the form of Islam that existed in Mecca and Medina was very different than the form of Islam that existed in the rest of the Muslim world, then Muslims would start thinking, hey, those guys don't represent anything real in the Muslim world. I mean, why are they in control of our two holy sites when they represent a marginality, an idiosyncrasy? And Saudi Arabia then really was confronted with a critical question, particularly in the 50s, of, well, do we change to try to restore some of this diversity back, or do we attempt to make the rest of the Muslim world more like us? Well, you can guess what option they opted for, right? They opted for the second one. Make the rest of the Muslim, try to make the rest of the Muslim world more like us. And they vested themselves so thoroughly in that option. Now, that option was also convenient for the fiscal policies of the royal family for reasons that you can read about in the book. It was convenient for, consistent with the foreign policies. It was consistent with their nationalistic orientation. It was consistent with all types of things that made that option particularly an attractive one. Now, can the Saudis now reverse this long history, sort of obtain a divorce from Wahhabism altogether and survive. Reasonable minds could disagree, but I think most experts say no, that it would be an impossible acrobatic act. And I tend to agree with that. I think that the Saudi royal family, I mean, who in their own personal lives are so irreligious that they are, far from the Puritanism of Wahhabism. I mean, just meet some of them in London, and you can, but they really put themselves in a tough place, and could they reverse it? I don't think so.
Questions keep coming here. We're only going to get to a few of the good ones. But here's one I think that follows on to the discussion we just had, the presentation, and that is, how have the differences between the Sunni and the Shia contributed to the rise of extremists?
That's a really good question. Well, the pivotal historical moment, I think, was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. What happened in Iran, the Iranian Revolution, terrified the Gulf states. They absolutely terrified the Gulf states. And there was the intelligence community was in agreement that it was a good part of the Iranian Revolution was actually its ideological foundations, its support, and so on. It was created by Iranian students studying particularly in the United States. So in other words, the foreign element coming back to affect the revolution. I mean, personally experienced this because I remember the literature. Saudi Arabia went on a massive anti-Shia campaign to effectively prevent any attempted connection between the revolutionary Iranians, particularly those who de-emphasized Shiism, like Qutbzadeh and Sadr and others, and so to prevent any attempted connection, Saudi Arabia really went on a huge anti-Shiism campaign in which, I remember we used to go to the mosque and we find these pamphlets for free that talk about the Shiites being worse enemies or worse enemies to Islam than the Jews. That they're a greater danger to Islam than the Israelis. That if given a choice between fighting Israelis or Shiites, it should be fighting Shiites. And I still, I've preserved quite a bit of these pamphlets because they were just, you could sense the frantic tone in them. Now, of course, this wasn't just done on just a purely political level. Wahhabi theologians went to work to provide the theological pillars or to develop theological foundations for that type of attitude. And in that sense, the Iranian Shia revolution definitely had an impact on the attitude of Wahhabis in seeking out even a more Puritan and unitary vision of Islam. But I should tell you that this was not completely unprecedented, because in the 1840s, the Wahhabis, what Saudi Arabia was effectively doing is reminding the Wahhabis of their sort of psychopathic hate of Shias, because in the 1840s, Wahhabi forces marched up to Iraq, invaded Najaf and Kufa and so on, and estimates vary, but some historians have put the estimates as much as the Wahhabi forces massacring close to 100,000 Shiites. This is in the 1840s. So, I mean, that is the extent to which the Puritanism of Wahhabism had an intense revulsion towards Shias, and you can understand the theological premises in the book, which which I explain.
There are about 4 or 5 persons in the audience that have asked a very similar question. I'm going to give you a flavor of this basic question from about 3 cards here. Why don't Islamic leaders denounce Islamic fundamentalism, terrorism? Why aren't they more vocal? What's stopping the majority of peace-loving Muslims from speaking out against the extremist act? Then Tom Friedman's column today noted that there was a bombing of a mosque during the holy month of Ramadan in Iraq, and that there were no denunciations of this by moderate Islamists or Muslim state leaders. What is your take on this? And this is interesting. My question is, why are the majority silent, including the scholars? Freedom is not free, after all. Please know that I'm a Muslim.
Well, I mean, it wouldn't have made a difference if you're Muslim or not. You would have gotten the same answer. At one level, we cannot be completely self-righteous about this because of the fact that we tend to be hard of hearing when it comes to the Islamic world. We tend to not know Muslim jurists or Muslim councils who have taken a very strong stand against either terrorism or extremism, or even more specifically Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. For instance, Gamal al-Banna in Egypt is a well-known jurist. Muhammad Amara has taken the same stance, even people from quarters that are rather surprising, like Assam al-Aryan from the Muslim Brotherhood, who, curiously enough, after doing so, was arrested by the Egyptian government and remains in detention. I mean, there's sometimes a question as to whether there is an effort by governments to seek the radicalization of Muslim movements in order to delegitimate them and make them less appealing to the mainstream. So, and it's critical here that we distinguish between Muslim governments and, let's say, Muslim scholars. Muslim governments are not necessarily, and in fact, in most cases, are distinctly secular. The Hosni Mubarak's government, despite their nice religious trappings, is a very secular government. Saddam Hussein's government was a very secular government. Assad's government, both the father and the son, very secular governments. Government in Yemen, despite the religious trappings, again, a very secular government. Algeria, very much so. Tunisia, very much so. Morocco, again, not some religious trappings, but fundamentally secular government, and so on. And they, like a lot of governments, they denounce terrorism or not, depending on political interests rather than principle, which I think is the sort of foreign affairs pair pragmatism model, I think is a problem all over the world, not just among Arab governments or so on. I mean, I think that the pragmatic model for foreign policy, or the conducting of foreign policy, has proven to be a abysmally failed model. Although in schools of international relations, that view is not the commonly accepted view. Muslim scholars are a different matter altogether, and there are among the moderate scholars, as I talk about in the book, they regularly denounce inhumane, immoral acts. Now, there's, they could do so writing an article in the Weft newspaper in Egypt, but how many Americans are going to know about an article published in Al Weft in Egypt? How many Americans have even heard of Al Weft, leave alone know about an article written in Weft? Books, again, I mean, how many Arabic books get translated to English? Very, 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 very few. So, some people who cozied up to American academic institutions like Sa'ad-Din Ibrahim or Saeed Ashmawi, they get occasionally something of theirs translated, but it's not that, even with those people who've cozied up and established relations with some academic institutions, they don't regularly get their material translated. So there's definitely a communications problem, and that's a critical part of it's a critical issue, because we would be able to support those who could be our partners in moral causes that we share, if we had a better way of knowing of their existence and their work. Most Arabs know English. It's fair to say that most Americans don't know Arabic. Now, having said that, there is no question that, and this is part of a serious problem, and even a real challenge to the Muslim world that I raise in the book, and rather talk about passionately, there remains this sense of what comes first, the religious principle, the moral principle, or political goals, and or political interests. And unfortunately, I believe that not just among the Puritans, but among many Muslim intellectuals, that faced with this type of tension, they choose to support the political goal, the political objective, the perceived political interest, and to basically make excuses by saying, we're weak people, we were a colonized people, we are a people who are politically dependent, so morality can be afforded by the rich and powerful, but moral principle cannot really be, you can't afford moral principle if you are disempowered and weak and so on.
Dr. Abou El Fadl, we have two questions.
Okay, let me just finish this thought and then...
And 90 seconds. Okay. This audience really wants to hear these two questions answered.
Okay. So, I mean, because this is the critical tension and a critical choice. I argue very passionately that it is the moral principle, if we are serious about being a religious people, it is the moral principle, it is the ethical principle that must prevail in every circumstance, and not the political interest. Otherwise, we betray our faith.
We really do just have a minute left, literally, and a law professor would hate to have me suggest this. However, both these questions, which our audience is dying to have answered, could be answered with a yes or no.
Oh my God.
And here they are.
No, it's like cross-examination.
Remember, I had to live under the 5-minute rule, and you're down to one. The American people have been told Islamic extremists hate the U.S. because of who we are or what we believe, not because of our foreign policy. Is that true, yes or no? Second question, based on a reading of the Qur'an, is the teaching of Islam fundamentally incompatible with Western-style secular market democracy?
Oh my God. Okay. First question. Can you read the question again?
Yes. Do Islamic extremists hate the U.S. because of who we are, what we stand for, or is it because of our foreign policy?
Largely, no.
It's not because of foreign policy?
It is because of our foreign policy.
It is, okay.
Yes. Largely, it's because of our foreign policy.
All right. That's a question that's often asked these days on the editorial page. Now, is there something fundamentally about the teaching of the Quran that makes the Islamic faith incompatible with Western-style secular market democracy?
In my view, largely the answer would be no.
That's a relief. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we had many excellent questions I never got to, and we had a great speaker here this evening, and of course, I think he demonstrated he's best when he's taking these questions head on, directly, not being forced to say yes or no. So on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Northern California and Cody's Cody's Bookstore. I'd like to thank Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl for sharing his insights with us this evening. And thank you, the audience, for your participation. And good night.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you. Great job. You did a great job. And now there is a book signing. And Cody's have the books over there.
Khaled Abou El Fadl is author of The Great Theft, Wresting Islam from the Extremists. It's published by HarperSanFrancisco. Visit harpersf.com for more information.